This is Research Like a Pro, episode 266, Shoot 'em Up Dick. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi Nicole, how are you today?
Doing great. What have you been working on?
Well, I have been revisiting the Keaton research that you did several years ago. And the reason why is because I went to South Carolina, as you know, and was part of their genealogy workshop, and they have the archives right there where I was teaching. And I had asked you, what do we need to look at for the Keatons in South Carolina? And it's always so hard, just off the cuff to think about what kind of research you can do. So what I ended up doing was going in and looking at some land information. We had the land grant, and we looked at a land plat there and looked at a map to see where that was. They had these great big historical maps, and it was so fun to find the actual place where William Keaton had his land. So when I came home, I wrote a blog post about that. But then I also wanted to get all of your old research from the old Google Sheets into Airtable. So I spent some time in the last few weeks doing that. So everything is now in Airtable, the research log and the timeline, and it just reinforced how much I love Airtable. So fun, so nice.
Good job putting all of the research in one place, and that's fun that you were able to do some land research on site in South Carolina.
It was fun. I wish we would have been able to drive over and see the land actually, but we were several hours away. It was over in the western part, and Columbia was more in the central part of South Carolina, and it just wasn't going to fit into our schedule that time. So another time we'll have to take that trip, and you can go with me.
Yay! For announcements today, we want to remind you that our Airtable Quick Reference Guide is available for sale on our website. And for next month's Research Like a Pro webinar, we have Ruth Campbell, and she is presenting Surprise! My Great-Grandfather Was the Milkman, a DNA case study. So that'll be on August 15th. And if you're not a member of our webinar series, we encourage you to sign up. And if you would like to receive more news and updates about our blog posts and podcast episodes and coupon codes, just join our weekly newsletter that comes out every Monday. Upcoming conferences, we are going to be at several. There's the East Coast Genetic Genealogy Conference that's virtual and in person, and we will be presenting virtually there. And then the Professional Management Conference by the Association of Professional Genealogists, APG, that's also virtual and in person, and we will be there in person in Salt Lake City, Utah. So we're looking forward to seeing a lot of you there. We'll be talking about how to incorporate multiple income streams and creating user-friendly client reports that incorporate DNA analysis. And that one will be live streamed by Diana. So we hope that you will participate in one of those conferences.
Right, it's fun to be a part of these smaller conferences. It's just exciting to talk about different topics, so I'm looking forward to both of those. Well, we have a fun question from listener Diane, and she says, I'm still back on episode 106 of your podcast, so maybe you've already done this, but I'll suggest it all the same. I hear you and Nicole mention different genealogy conferences, and it makes me yearn to start sticking money aside to finance a trip to a genealogy conference. That would be a really big deal for me, but I wouldn't know which one to go to. I'm not a newbie really, but I'm a newbie to doing genealogy right by becoming a researcher rather than a searcher who chases squirrels every time she gets online. RootsTech, something else? I'd really appreciate a suggestion of a conference that offers different levels as well as the costs. Anyway, just a suggestion, and I would so love to attend one of yours or Nicole's sessions. So thanks for that question and that comment. I would definitely suggest RootsTech. It's really inexpensive, and it has the extra value of being right by the Family History Library. So you can combine learning with going over and doing some research, and it definitely has got all levels. So, what do you think, Nicole?
I love RootsTech. It has something for everyone. And I know you've been working on an advanced track. I don't know if that's public yet, but that's something neat that could be possibly coming out. And so it's a good conference for all levels.
It really is. And I like RootsTech also because you've got your research classes, but then they also have classes on writing stories or organizing or keeping track of photos. And then the expo hall is huge. And so you always want to have time to go through the expo hall and see all the really neat companies that have these amazing products to help you. And they also have really exciting opening sessions. It's just a fun conference. You know, I also really love the National Genealogy Society conference. Just came back from Richmond, Virginia doing that one. And that one is great as well. It is a little pricier, and next year will be virtual. So if you are starting to save your pennies, I would suggest saving up for RootsTech in Salt Lake City the first part of March and see what you think. That was our first conference, and we couldn't believe we hadn't been going all along. We just had no idea how fun conferences were.
Agreed. That was a fun first conference, and we went to that every year for several years before we ever went to the National Genealogical Society conference. So the National Genealogical Society is more academic, and they have a lot of more intermediate and advanced level classes. And then Roots Tech has all levels, and they have a lot more choices. And like you said, they have those big fun sessions, and they have the best exhibitor halls. They're both wonderful.
They really are. And I did want to give a shout out to the website conferencekeeper.org. And that is a great place to just see what is going on. Besides these big conferences, there are all sorts of smaller conferences. There was just a German conference, there's a conference on Jewish genealogy, there's an African American conference. There are all sorts of more specific type of conferences. So if you go to conferencekeeper.org, you can see exactly what is coming up, and it also has a list of online presentations. So I do a lot of society presentations, Zoom calls online, and I try to put those on the website when I'm doing those and put those in our newsletter. But sometimes I don't get all of them there. But conferencekeeper.org tries to keep a listing of all sorts of events. So you can look at any one day and you'll see there are several societies having a presentation that day, and you might find that it's something you want to learn. Some of these are free, some of them you have to join the society to go to, but you know, it's just a great place to see what's going on in the education world.
Good idea to check Conference Keeper. Well, today's topic is about ancestors who were outcasts. And this was the prompt for a recent blog post that Diana wrote. Maybe think about, do you have an ancestor who is an outcast? And what kind of situations could result in a person becoming an outcast from their family or society? Sometimes these ancestors are the subject of a family story that you've heard of because it's kind of a mystery, or it entails some kind of crime or misdeed, argument, or another event. And often these kind of mysteries make us want to uncover the facts behind the story and help us discover more. Today, we'll talk about the outcast from our family tree, and his name is William Shootem Up Dick Schultz.
So there obviously is a story about Shootem Up Dick Schultz. And this is one that was written about by a couple of family members. And so I used some of their words in the blog post. And there were two notable stories passed down about William Shootem Up Dick Schultz in my family. First of all, my dad told of Uncle Dick's involvement in the death of Dick's oldest brother, William Henderson Schultz. And William Henderson Schultz is my direct line. He is my second great grandfather, and he died young. So this was the story that my dad always told, and I have it in writing when he was writing some history. And he said, in 1884, in Brown County, Texas, Dick and William Henderson were out riding, and Dick flicked William Henderson's horse with his whip. causing the horse to start bucking and running. William Henderson held on, but when he finally got off the horse, he had blood coming out of his ears and mouth. He died shortly after. So, that's really a sad story. He was pretty young when he died, and I can only imagine how horrible Uncle Dick would have felt with that situation. So, as I said, William Henderson was my second great grandfather, and this death in 1884 left his widow, Eliza Ann Eisenhower, with 4 young children, and she was expecting another baby at the time. So, she ended up remarrying a year later, and interestingly enough, her second husband, Jacob Meek, was a recent widower as well. He'd been married to her sister, who also had died. So we have a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law marrying. At that time, you, for the most part, because it was such a hard life, needed 2 parents there. So with Jacob, they moved north to Indian Territory about 1892. And I don't know for sure because we don't have that 1890 census and I don't have any specifics about Uncle Dick moving with the family, but I do know that he eventually did end up in Indian Territory in Oklahoma because we have another story. And this one is by my great grandfather, William Houston Schultz. He was one of the children that was left without a father when his father died in that accident. And he always stayed very close to Uncle Dick, so he knew what was going on with him. So he tells the story that while in Oklahoma, Dick was at a dance one evening with a girl. Her boyfriend came in drunk and they got into a fight. Dick ended up shooting the man and had to leave town. He was later known as Shootem Up Dick Schultz. So that was the story that came down. I've just always wished I could find more information about it. I someday hope maybe to find something in the newspapers, but haven't found that yet. But the story goes on that Uncle Dick fled to Arizona Territory to escape any repercussions from the law. And I know he stayed close to our branch of the family because my grandfather, Charles Leslie Schultz, visited him in Arizona. And he has a little snippet in his life history about Uncle Dick. And so my grandpa wrote, in the spring of 1926, about April or May, I went to Sanger, California and went to work in the grape vineyard for a while. Then Tiger Valley, I went to work for a big rancher out there, and I worked for him through 1926. In 1927, I went to Arizona to help Dad's uncle, Uncle Dick. Bob was born the 16th of March, 1927. When he was about 3 or 4 weeks old, I went to Arizona. My wife and the boys couldn't come because it snowed in the mountains, but I went on out there to try and run the ranch for Uncle Dick. He had his arms broken, and he couldn't do anything, and I had to take care of him for 6 or 8 months. Evidently, even though, I'm calling him an outcast, I think he was more outcast just from society than the family because, my grandpa went out to help him and stayed there for quite some time. And I do have some other stories about when my grandmother and the children could join him and that they lived there for a bit with him in Arizona.
That is quite the story with a girl at the dance.
Yes.
Yeah, I wonder, that would be really fascinating to find out if there were a newspaper article. And it seems like at that time, was it still Indian Territory? Was this before 1907?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was still Indian Territory and it was the Wild West. I have got some other histories out of Indian Territory, and people wore their guns, and if you got in a fight, apparently it was easier to use the gun than the law or anything else to settle it, depending on the person. It does make you wonder.
Yeah. Well, let's learn more about Uncle Dick and his early years. He was the youngest son born to Rachel Cox and Hickman Monroe Schultz. He was born in 1864 and was listed as age 5 on the 1870 federal census of Falls County, Texas. And it always seemed odd that Monroe and Rachel named their oldest and youngest sons by the same name of William. So that is an interesting one. On that census, you'll see Monroe Schultz and Rachel Schultz, age 50 and 43, and Monroe was a farmer. And then you have the first William, who was age 22, and he was a farm laborer. And then there's Martin, Apollonia, Lucinda, Francis, Delilah, Maria, John, and then the younger William, age 5, then probably another laborer named Andrew French. So strange. And I guess it makes sense, though, that he went by Dick because probably he didn't want to go by the same name as his older brother. By 1880, the children's mother, Rachel, had died, and Hickman Monroe Schultz was a widower with 4 children at home. Another child, Eliza, had been born. Perhaps Rachel died at her birth, but there's no headstone or death information that we know of. On the 1880 census, Uncle Dick was still going by William, and this was at age 14. And so this census enumeration shows H.M. Schultz, which is Hickman Monroe Schultz, and then the 4 children that still lived at home: Mary, 19, Johnny, 16, William, 14, and Eliza, 8. So we don't know when Uncle Dick was involved in the incident requiring him to leave Indian Territory after shooting a man, but later in life, he entered a retirement home in Coconino County, Arizona, where he reported that he first arrived in Arizona in 1898 in Tombstone. So that's a pretty good estimate for when he left Indian Territory and arrived in Arizona. Now, the city of Tombstone, Arizona had begun with a silver strike in 1877, and people flooded into the area hoping to get rich quickly. By the mid 1800s, it was growing as quickly as San Francisco or St. Louis. There were cowboys, speculators, prospectors, homesteaders, businessmen, and gunmen who made their way to the city. So it's no wonder that Uncle Dick would have gone there as well, looking for a place to lay low. Now, I live in Tucson, and it's not too far away from Tombstone. In fact, we've visited Tombstone, and it's a fun, kind of historic town now, a touristy place where you can go and see reenactments of gunfights. It does seem like the perfect place for Uncle Dick.
It really does. And I did want to mention when you were talking about the censuses that when I first found those censuses, I really questioned William Schultz because that name just made no sense to me. It wasn't like it was William Richard, that they could take the Dick from the shortening of Richard. And I knew this family story that he existed. I have pictures of him, with the family. So I knew this man existed and I knew he was a brother of our William Henderson. But I still was just kind of curious about that. And I thought that was so odd. And so at the end of this podcast, we'll reveal a record that shows, yeah, he definitely was in this family. But it was fun because I was doing some research. I believe it was on Genealogical. That's a website we don't really talk about much, but I was exploring that, and they have a really nice newspaper search. And I always put in my surnames. I put in Royston, I put in Schultz, I put in Eisenhower just to see what pops up. And Schultz popped up a lot of newspaper articles about Uncle Dick, and they were in Arizona. And so, oh my goodness, I learned so much more about him from the newspaper. So we're just going to go through some of these because it's kind of fascinating how the newspaper is giving us a little hint of his life. So in 1902, he was in the Wichita Daily Eagle. So he must have spent some time in Kansas because they posted there that there were letters remaining at the post office for Dick Schultz and a J.W. Schultz. So my thought was maybe he left that as a permanent address for his Oklahoma family until he made his way to Arizona. Because, if he had gone to Arizona in 1898, maybe he, said, okay, I'm going to write back to Wichita. And that's just north of Oklahoma. But in 1904, the Williams News reports a Dick Schultz on the list of uncalled for letters at the post office in Williams, Arizona. And that's where he ends up settling, is Williams, Arizona. So we've got that 1898, he supposedly arrived in Tombstone, and then in 1902 in Kansas, they have some letters there waiting for him. And then he'd finally made his way to Williams, Arizona by 1904. So it gives us a little bit of a timeline there. Of course, can't find him on the 1900 census. So, with all of that moving around He's been missed unless he pops up somewhere completely strange. But in 1905, the Williams News reports that Dick Schultz, a cowboy of the Texas type, while attempting to brand a 2-year-old steer at the J.D. Ranch the first of the week, had the misfortune to have the steer, which was lying on the ground, throw its head around and run one of its horns into his left foot.
Oh,
So
ouch.
he had a series of accidents. I mean, he kept getting hurt. And, I grew up with cows in Idaho, and they can be kind of dangerous, especially if they don't have those horns taken off like they do nowadays, most of them. So, in 1905, we get the reports that Burt Daniels, Tom Hughes, and Dick Schultz were visitors this week. So I love these small town newspapers that report just these little details. It's like they were looking for something to put in the newspaper, but it's fun. And then in 1906, they list donations for San Francisco sufferers, and Dick Schultz gave $1. So that was for, I believe, the big San Francisco fire. So that was kind of a fun little historical connection there. But then also in 1906, we have another terrible accident, and it says Dick Schultz, a Texas cowboy who for some time past has been employed at the local sawmill, met with a serious accident there last Saturday morning, which nearly cost him his life. His clothing became caught about a shaft, and in a twinkling both of his arms were drawn round the shaft and crushed till they were scarcely recognizable as arms. Both bones of the left forearm were broken, while the right was broken both above and below the elbow. It was feared for a time that the left arm would have to be amputated, as the circulation was almost stopped owing to the crushed condition. But we are glad to state now that Dick will be out as soon as the bones begin to knit. He certainly had a close call at losing both arms as well as his life. So that is horrifying. And then a month later, they report that Dick Schultz, who had both arms broken recently at the mill, is again able to be around, though he still carries one arm in a sling. So if my dad had read all this and known about this before he passed away, he would have just said, oh yeah, Uncle Dick was a tough hombre. And he would totally have thought, yep, he would have been up and around. So then we have something interesting in 1907, and we have a lawsuit. In the case of Dick Schultz versus Saginaw and Manistee Lumber Company, an action brought by Schultz to recover $31,250 for injuries which he claimed to have sustained on the 26th day of May 1906. Well, yes, I would imagine so. It said the defense filed a motion to dismiss the action for want of merit, and the court allowed the motion, which ends the case. So sadly, it doesn't sound like he got anything out of it.
Wow.
So, back in the day.
Yeah, it seems like they didn't have very good rules and laws about workplace injuries in 1907 in Williams, Arizona.
No, probably no laws in Arizona about that at the time.
That would be a lot of money, 31,000 today. That's
Yes.
quite a hefty medical bill.
Yes.
You discovered a lot about Uncle Dick in the newspapers. That is incredible.
And we're not done yet.
Okay, well, let's see what happened with the next federal census in 1910. After the initial census records that Uncle Dick was found on, where he was a child in the household of his parents in 1870 and 1880, there wasn't any census record with Uncle Dick that we could find him on until 1910. And in that census, he appeared in Coconino County, Arizona, and he was age 44, working as a cowboy on the range. Then, not too long after the 1910 census, we have Uncle Dick getting married. And so on February 25th, 1914, there's another family story about this marriage. And Uncle Dick married a woman named Selma, and family legend has it that he traveled to San Francisco and met Selma there, where she was working for the Levi Strauss Company. Their marriage took place in Coconino County, Arizona, where Dick resided. We don't know for sure, but perhaps he did travel to San Francisco and then brought her home to marry. And not too much later, in March of that same year, 1914, the Williams News reported, notice is hereby given that the lands described below, embracing 376 acres within the Turayan National Forest, Arizona, will be subject to settlement and entry under the provisions of the homestead laws of the United States. Any settler who was actually and in good faith claiming any of said lands for agricultural purposes prior to January 1st, 1906, and has not abandoned same, has a preference right to make a homestead entry for the lands actually occupied. And Dick Schultz is listed as a settler with a preference to these lands. So he was working on a homestead entry there. Later that year, in September of 1914, the Coconino Sun lists a crop and chattel mortgage for Dick Schultz to Johnson and McConkey. So he was doing some business there. And then from March 1914 to September 1916, there were several newspaper notices in the Williams News for an application of Dick Schultz with a land description. In January 1915, the Williams News reported that Dick Schultz, a rancher from Spring Valley, was transacting business in Williams today. Now, that is quite good reporting. They just really had a finger on everything that was happening.
They really did. Isn't that hilarious? These just make me laugh. That was big news, apparently.
He's transacting business today. And then in September of 1915, the Coconino Sun has a notice, water location notice, Schultz Spring, Dick Schultz at the county recorder's office. And then April 6, 1916, in the Williams News, Dick Schultz of Spring Valley was a Maine visitor Monday. Mr. Schultz started to Maine in his wagon and mired down in mud to the hub of the wagon. He was forced to unhitch and walk back to Maine and pack his groceries out on his back. Now, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing Maine refers to a place within Arizona.
I'm pretty sure it's not Maine on the eastern seaboard. So, yes, I think that's another fun one. So, we are getting a real we're getting a really good idea of what life was like back then, 1915. In these next few entries, we start getting some other interesting things about Uncle Dick and how he was running up against the government. So in 1917, the Williams News tells us that Dick Schultz, a homesteader who has been claiming part of the government farm at the Spring Valley Ranger Station, was placed under arrest last Friday by Deputy U.S. Marshal Weege and taken to Tucson, where the federal court is in session to stand trial. The arrest of Mr. Schultz followed upon his repeated refusal to vacate government land at the ranger station after receiving due warning. Mr. Schultz took up a small homestead adjoining the ranger station at Spring Valley 5 years ago. Lacking a house on his homestead, he later asked permission to move temporarily into a shack on the ranger farm. This was granted him. A winter passed, and still Mr. Schultz remained in the shack and made no effort to erect a house on his own homestead. He was accordingly given warning to move off by a certain date, but when the time set had passed, he had no preparations to move. The Forest Service then extended its leniency by setting aside 2.5 acres that took in the shack as part of his homestead, so that he'd be complying with the homestead laws and living on his land, thus giving him his house. Mr. Schultz next asked to be allowed to lease 30 acres of the ranger farm. The lease was granted to him. The lease money should have been paid in advance, but was not paid at all. Mr. Schultz was then ordered to vacate the leased land. Instead, he began fencing it in, asserting he was going to homestead it. This action resulted in the Forest Service being forced to take decisive action to dislodge him. He was accordingly placed under arrest last Friday and taken to Tucson for trial on a charge of trespass. So apparently he wanted to do things his own way. And, I'm thinking about Selma, his new wife, and she's having to live in a shack. And it's no wonder that they later separated. She didn't stick with him. They never had any children together. And reading that makes me really think, no wonder she said, okay, I'm done. Well, in 1917, we find out that last Friday, Bobby Burns drove Deputy U.S. Marshal Weege out to Spring Valley in his tin Beetle to make the arrest of Dick Schultz. It was a poor day for sightseeing with the pouring rain, but nevertheless, the gentlemen report having taken in all the side trips, with the result that they didn't reach their destination till rather late in the day. It had been predicted that Schultz would resist arrest, but no difficulty was experienced. Coming back, the Beetle demonstrated that it is no water bug, but consented to carry the men on solid land, provided they carried it across the boggy places. So the Tin Beetle, 1917. Do you think that was a really old car?
That's quite the name for a vehicle.
I am not sure what that is. Maybe it was more like a wagon or a sled. I don't know. I guess I should have tried to do some research on that too. But I just thought that was such an interesting story. And maybe the reason they report so much on Uncle Dick is because he was a character and caused trouble in town. I don't know. They thought he was going to resist arrest, apparently. When I was reading that for the first time, that was pretty funny. Next census we have is 1920, and Dick and Selma, she's still with them there in Spring Valley, Coconino County, and it does show her German birth fitting with the family story. Following the troubles with the land reported in the newspapers, Dick was finally able to secure a land patent in 1925 on the Gila River and the Salt River Meridian. And I was able to find an image of exactly where that land was, and it shows it just north of Flagstaff, Arizona, and south of the Grand Canyon in the Kaibab National Forest, and he got that land patent in 1925. So the family stories were that Dick and Selma separated sometime in the 1930s, so she really did stick with him for a long time. But with no children to care for him, Dick entered the Yavapai County Pioneer Home for a time as an elderly man. And his entry papers verify his father was Monroe Schultz and his mother's Rachel Cox. So there you go. That was the final proof I needed. I mean, I was pretty sure he was in that family, but with the two Williams in the censuses, it was kind of odd. He ended up dying on February 16th, 1949 in Williams, Coconino, Arizona. And as I said, I do have some pictures of him, and he's got a nice suit on, but he's got a really big white mustache coming all the way down and with a very grumpy look. So I have an earlier one where he still looks kind of grumpy and has a mustache and a hat. He was a tall man, it looks like. So it's fun to see pictures, and it's fun to learn all about him. So I don't know, would you consider him an outcast? After learning all that about him, he certainly did have many unfortunate incidents with the law, and he seemed to be an outcast in that sense. But his family stood by him, and thanks to the family stories and the historical records, and especially those newspaper articles, I could tell much more about this uncle's life story.
Wow. Yeah, I think he does fit the bill pretty well for somebody who was somewhat of a social outcast, somebody who wanted to go live in the middle of the forest. And the police or whoever, the authorities didn't really want him to do what he was doing. So,
Right. So it was really fun researching this. I think anytime you've got a character in your family history that you hear a lot of stories about, you want to know more. And so I was just really thrilled to find all those newspaper articles that filled in so many pieces of the story that didn't come down in the family. I don't even know if my family knew about any of those. You know, maybe he didn't share everything that was going on out in Arizona with them.
right. And there were some great newspapers in Arizona at that time in Coconino County. That's wonderful.
The Williams News. It'd be fun to go back now and just read more of the news and see what else they reported, because if they were reporting on Uncle Dick, I'm pretty sure they're reporting on anybody else in the area. So if any of our
Mhm.
listeners have family in Williams, Arizona, make sure you go check out the newspaper, because it's like a pretty good gossip column of everything in the community.
For sure. Now, just going back to the name situation, do you think that they named them both William because they were planning on them going by their middle names? What about William Henderson Schultz? Did he go by Henderson?
The things in the records that I see were WH, but a lot of times they would just use initials in the
Yeah.
records or in the censuses sometimes. But you know, he never went by Henderson. Interestingly enough, when he died, Eliza Ann Eisenhower was pregnant with her fifth child, and they named her Henderson. It was a girl, and they named her Henderson. And I learned that that was a tradition, that if the husband died and the child hadn't been born, you would name the child after the husband. So
Oh,
she actually went by Henderson, and I have never been able to find anything else that shows him just being Henderson or just William. It's usually just WH.
yeah, that's really odd that they named two children William. But it makes sense that when he was older, he didn't want to go by William. He went by Dick because he wanted his own name.
And he might have been going that all along, but in the census, maybe they were giving, sometimes they'll use the
True.
more formal form of the name,
Yeah.
because it doesn't really seem like he would all of a sudden just be going by that nickname. However, he could have been.
That's true. And some of these families, they all had nicknames. that they went by.
They really did. And that can throw us off when we're looking at censuses or records, wondering if it is our person, just like in this scenario. And so it was really good to finally get that record where definitely Dick Schultz was the son of Monroe Schultz and Rachel Cox. Because until then, I really didn't have something that positively identified him as being, that connection.
Well, thanks for sharing your research, and it was fun to review all of these newspaper articles and records about Uncle Dick, our outcast in the family. We look forward to future episodes where we get to talk about these fun articles that you're writing about our ancestors and following the prompts for the 52 Ancestors series. So this is fun.
It is fun. And when I started writing these, I realized I wanted to source cite them, but I didn't have source citations for these records yet. I hadn't done a whole project on them, didn't have them in a research log. And so what I've been doing is starting an Airtable base for each ancestor I'm writing about. And then as I'm doing the research for the blog post, going back and gathering up the records that I put into his folder and creating the citations and doing the timeline. So it's been really fun because I've been able to shore up my research, and creating the Airtable gives me a good place to put all those citations and links and details. So it's been a fun way to get some research done all along as I write these.
That's such a great way to do it, little by little, and not, a whole chunk that feels overwhelming, just
Exactly.
small amounts.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we will talk to you again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at FamilyLocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.